Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Steve Ross, director of the USC Kasdan Institute and Dean's Professor of History at USC. And on behalf of the Kasdan Institute and USC, we'd like to welcome you to today's Kasdan conversation between me and Professor Matthew Dallek on dealing with his book and the larger themes on the radical right and anti-Semitism, how bigotry has energized the far right, from John Birch Society to MAGA. And during its heyday in the 1960s, the John Birch Society vigorously denied charges that it promoted anti-Semitism and white supremacy. Birches said that they accepted members from all faiths and backgrounds and insisted that their critics smeared them as part of a communist plot to silence one of the only true American anti-communist organizations. Yet some of the nation's most notorious anti-Semites had close ties with the Birchers, including Holocaust deniers Willis Carto and James Oviatt. The Birchers also provided the ideological inspiration to a variety of successors, including presidential candidates, members of Congress, and notable white supremacists. And wrapping their cause in the mantle of Americanism and making America great, Birchers helped forge a sprawling movement whose ideas continue to dominate far-right politics. And we'll explore this topic in the next hour, but before then, I'd like to introduce our featured speaker, Professor Matthew Dallek. And Matt is a historian and professor of political management at George Washington University's College of Professional Studies, and he is the author of The Right Moment, Ronald Reagan's First Victory and the Decisive Turning Point in American Politics, which I can strongly recommend any of you interested in Reagan's political background. He doesn't start in 1980, but in the mid-60s, to really document in a wonderfully written book the transformation of the conservative wing of the party. He's also the author of Defenseless Under the Night, and his op-eds have appeared in the LA Times, New York Times, Washington Post, Politico. And his newest book, which is at the heart of today's conversation, is called Birchers: How the John Birch Society Radicalized the American Right. And it is putting a plug in because it's a wonderful book to read. It is available on Amazon and some bookstores. Welcome, Matthew.
Thanks so much for having me.
Sure, delighted. And today's format, as our usual Kasdan conversations, Matthew's could open up with a brief overview of the sort of subject for today. Then he and I will talk till roughly 5 o'clock, and then we're going to leave a half hour for Q&A. And on your Zoom meeting page, you will see a chat box. And as we're talking, please enter in any questions you have. And at the end, for the last half hour, I'll sort of moderate your questions and pose them to Matthew. So again, Matthew, welcome, and welcome all of you here. So why don't you start by giving us an overview?
Great. First of all, I just want to thank you, Steve, for having me, and the Kasdan Institute, which does such amazing work, academic work, and also work reaching the public about the history and the contemporary issues related to Jewish life in the U.S. It's really an honor for me to be here, so thank you so much. And I thought what I do is just spend about 7 or 8 minutes briefly explaining why I wanted to write a book about the John Birch Society and its afterlife. So I would go back about a decade ago. You know, Steve mentioned I had written this book about Ronald Reagan's first campaign. And so I was always interested in conservatism. But about a decade ago, I started to notice that a lot of commentators were writing about the John Birch Society as a kind of grassroots predecessor to the Tea Party. And the historian Sean Wilentz wrote about the Birchers and the Tea Party in the New Yorker. A book appeared about the John Birch Society's worldview based on the society's, primarily on the society's publications. There was also actually a biography of John Birch himself, who was an evangelist turned warrior murdered by Mao's communist forces about 10 days after the end of World War II. And of course, the group was named after him. And I just kind of took mental note of this mini surge of interest in the Birchers. And around this time, there was a historian who called for more studies of conservative extremism, and especially the Birchers, because a lot had been written about conservatives over the past 2 decades, since the mid-1990s. But she said, more needs to be done on extremism. And I also noted that as well and kind of filed it away. And as I was doing research for my first book on Reagan, I had dealt with the Birch Society and sort of was interested in how Reagan and conservatives, as they tried to position themselves to be electorally viable, how they dealt with the question of extremism. Because one of the biggest attacks on him was that he was an extremist and outside the bounds of respectable two-party politics. So that was an interesting theme. And then, of course, most obviously, with the rise of Trump, a lot of historians and many others, and journalists and pundits and just many people wondered, first of all, how did Trump win? But for historians in particular, it was a bit head-spinning because there had been so much scholarship on conservatism, yet a lot of people, including me, still felt blindsided by Trump's rise to power. And since that time, there have been some scholars who have argued that the fringe, the right-wing fringe, the kind of MAGA movement, was really at the heart or in the vanguard of conservatism through a good chunk of the 20th century. And the implication, of course, is that Trumpism was a logical, almost apotheosis of the modern American right. And then the last thing that interested me is that even though there had been a lot written about the Birchers in the 1960s and on through the last decade, I did not think that there had been a really interesting kind of book about the movement as a whole and the grassroots in particular, and not just a single study of a suburb or a state, but looking at it kind of as a national phenomenon. I also thought that it was an opportunity, and I tried to do this in the book as well, to bring in the non-members who supported the movement, right, conservatives sympathetic to it, but who didn't belong, and then also the numerous conservative, liberal, and other critics, and there were many. So I thought it was a chance to say something new about the organization and its impact on conservative politics through the decades, and to address some questions that had somewhat been addressed, but I thought could be addressed more fully. Who were the Birchers? What did they believe? How did those beliefs shape their actions? And then what impact did they have, both in their heyday in the 1960s, but also afterward? And thinking about, well, why did the organization shrivel? And how did their ideas and tactics, as I argue, how did those live on or have a long afterlife? I drew on nearly 24 archival collections, trying to capture myriad perspectives on the movement. And I really am grateful to be here and to talk about the book and some larger themes about the far right and the persistence of anti-Semitism. So with that, I'm going to stop. And Steve, thank you again for having me.
Great. I think where I'd like to start today is by unpacking political labels, because we throw around left, right, center, I think very loosely. And one of the things the MAGA movement has, as you were, I think, hinting, it's forced us to have a closer look at what we mean by conservatism. So let me start by asking you, you refer in your book, not a manuscript anymore, to the John Birch Society as being the country's most notorious far-right movement. And so the question I want to say is, what do we actually mean by the far right? And can you distinguish between conservatives, the far right, and the ultra right? Or do you see them as one and the same?
Well, first, that's a great question. I don't see them as one and the same. One of the main arguments in the book is that the Birch Society helped to establish an alternative political tradition on the far right. So, you asked very correctly, well, what do I mean by that? Well, I really mean their ideas. And I distinguish those ideas from all of the electorally successful, more mainstream conservatives, because historians typically have kind of divided conservatism between more moderates like Dwight Eisenhower, who dominated the party for years, especially in the 1950s, and then more movement conservatives, first with Barry Goldwater in 64 when he was a nominee, and then more enduringly with Ronald Reagan. And what I'm arguing, in part at least, is that there was another division. And that division was, at least in part or in large part, based on ideas. So I identify four. There are, I think, more ideas. But the division, I think, comes down to, as I say in the book, conspiracy theories, an explicit or more explicit form of racism, an anti-interventionism versus a mainstream conservatives who tended to be much more internationalist and interventionist. And then finally, on the far right, a more violent, anti-establishment, apocalyptic mode of politics. And in the 1960s, those ideas were widely considered, I think, on the far right edge of the political spectrum. Now, you raise this other really interesting question, which is the ultra right or the ultra far right. My sense is that there absolutely were individuals and groups who were even fringier than the John Birch Society. At one point, I think in the book, I kind of refer to them as the fringe of the fringe. Now, some of these folks, though, were actually in the Birch Society. A number of them, I think, passed through the Birch Society, and then and some of them decided, the Birch Society was not violent enough, it wasn't anti-Semitic enough, it wasn't as fringe really as they wanted it. But the point I want to make is that I think that within this sort of far right space, I think that there's a continuum, and on that continuum, it was fairly fluid. The Birchers, for example, had a number of ties to the KKK, the white citizens councils, Willis, I could go on, but people like Willis Carto, who became one of the, Steve, as you know, one of the country's leading Holocaust deniers, was a member of the Birch Society. Robert Depew, who went on to form the Minutemen, was a member. Michael King was his name at the time, but Mayor Kahan, who was convicted on charges, I think, of making explosives, was a Bircher. A man named Louis Beyer, founder of the Patriotic Youth Association, which was sort of prone to violence. A man, we'll talk about him maybe later, but Revillo Oliver, who espoused eugenics and anti-Semitism. I can go on. And so I think that there was a fluidity here, but those ideas, again, however imperfectly, of conspiracism, explicit racism, an interest in sovereignty and isolationism, and this more violent, apocalyptic, anti-establishment mode of politics, I think that those help define the far right as I'm defining it. And then the last thing I'll say, and then I'll be quiet, is that in the 1960s, the Birchers were widely seen as the embodiment of the far right. Now, there were other elements too, of course, the KKK, massive resistance, civil rights, but the Birchers became a kind of emblem of ultra-conservatism or pseudo-conservatism, and its critics really saw them, and conservatives too saw them as sort of the, defined, I think, the far right through the lens of the Birch Society.
So let's get very specific then. What were the goals of the Birchers, and why couldn't they achieve those goals within the mainstream parties?
Well, the goals of the Birchers, the leadership of the society believed that there was a communist conspiracy inside the United States. And it looked at both political parties, and in particular, the Republican Party, which was sort of the natural home And they thought that both these parties, especially the Republicans, had basically denied the truth about the communist menace. And not only that, but had conspired with communists to basically turn the United States into a communist country. And so Robert Welch, the founder of the Birchers, his really most infamous charge was that Dwight Eisenhower, the hero of D-Day and the president at the time, was a dedicated agent of the communist conspiracy. So they believed that, and also, Robert Welch supported people like Joe McCarthy and Robert Taft, both of whom they saw the Republican Party as pushing them out of the party and basically silencing them. And actually, at one point, Welch even alleged, with no evidence, that Bob Taft, the senator from Ohio, was killed. He died from a peculiar cancer because someone had implanted a radium tube in the back of his Senate chair. And so there was this conspiracy that someone had conspired to basically take out one of his two heroes. So they saw the Republican Party really as an apostate, and the goal of the society, as they put it, was to educate the country, right? It was to mobilize a kind of shock force, shock troopers of Americanists, of real patriots, of religious folks who would go around the country and in their communities work to expose the communist conspiracy and educate the people of the country so that they could then eventually, I guess, vote in the correct people.
So you talk about communists. To what extent did Birchers and the American public at that time actually understand what communism is? I asked my class the other day in preparation. I'll be specific, because I was telling them briefly, and I said, communism is the boogeyman of MAGA, and it's been the boogeyman in America since the 40s, actually earlier, but particularly since post-war. And I asked how many of them, and this is a freshman, sophomore class, could distinguish between communism as it was defined by Marx and Engels and communism as it was practiced by the Soviet Union after 1917. And I would say maybe 20% of students raised their hand. Do people even know what communism is, and what are they talking about?
Well, the way I would answer that is that communism was a brilliant kind of catch-all because it meant different things to different people. And what I argue in the book is that the Birchers could filter a kind of single-minded a brand of conspiracy theories, of anti-communist conspiracy theories through the perceived needs of their community. So some of them defined it as textbooks that their kids were reading or sex education in the school, right? That there was a moral dimension to the communist threat. Others saw it as not just taxation, but the basically entire progressive era, New Deal era expansion of the federal government. The Birch Society argued that the civil rights movement of the 1960s was an agent of the Kremlin, and defined and basically put up erected billboards showing Martin Luther King as alleging that he was at a communist training school. And it wasn't, of course. It was he was at a school for labor and civil rights organizing. So the insight, I think, that Welch had, and to kind of answer, did they understand what communism was? I think they generally viewed it as something on the left, having to do with the growth of government, the imposition of centralized federal authority over communities, in particular the South, right, and kind of whether the states could decide whether to integrate or not, and that there was a kind of moral dimension as well to it, that it spoke to a kind of Christian and religious, this idea that communism was going to destroy all religion. And so when they were talking about communism in the United States in the 1960s, there were not really many communists. I mean, there were a paltry number of actual communists, but the way they defined it was very expansive. And so they could use it in all these sorts of ways to, mobilize people around a variety of issues. And people responded to different issues in different ways, at least in the Birch Society.
Well, isn't
it? Get it?
Yeah, isn't a big mobilizer and I'm not sure the extent to which the Birchers used it, so you might want to talk about it, but their predecessors, the word communist was always followed by Jew, that every communist is a Jew and every Jew is a communist. So where do the Birchers fall out on the link between anti-communism and anti-Semitism?
Well, that's a big question.
Yeah, it is a big question.
It's a good question. So the Birch Society, as you said at the outset, officially, they said, we accept any member as long as they're religious, right? They just have to be a believer. We accept Jews and Muslims, on and on. It didn't matter. They also said further that we have some Jewish members, including a member, well, actually one of their leaders, a spokesperson, Samuel Blumenfeld. And they would kind of cart this out and say, look, we accept Jews, we accept also African Americans. We're not racist, we're not anti-Semitic, and we don't tolerate that. The truth, I think, as much as I could get at it in the book, is a lot more complicated. The headquarters, the kind of leaders of the Birch Society, at times did try to police their ranks. So there's a series of memos I found in which a member, a Bircher, is writing into headquarters and saying that, this Bircher has studied the issue, and that really the fault, the reason we've gone communistic in this country is the fault of the Jews. And so it gets at kind of what you're saying as well, right? It's sort of Jewish, communist, it's one and the same. What was interesting, though, is that the headquarters responded, and you can see the notes they're writing to each other. The leadership is responding, is this guy anti-Semitic or what? Someone else writes, he's a wild man, drop him. So you do see efforts at the leadership level to try to kind of occasionally police their ranks. But there were a lot of anti-Semites in the movement. And there were a number of other times in which, and this is why I argue they draw energy from them, they said, well, Israel, they would kind of soft pedal the issue, so to speak. They would say, like this guy, James Oviatt, the haberdasher in LA. They didn't really make any effort, as far as I can tell, to expel him, even though he was sending out material that was essentially the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, right? The most notorious anti-Semitic tract. And at the leadership level, one of the founders, a guy named Revillo Oliver, who was actually a classics professor at the University of Illinois, Oliver went around the country giving explicitly racist and anti-Semitic speeches. He would use a mocking Jewish accent. He once alleged falsely that Israel was importing or exporting LSD to the United States to get all the kids, the students on campus high on drugs. He promulgated eugenics and talked about biological differences between the races. And, this was at the top, right, at the leadership. So, there were ways in which bigotry and anti-Semitism, despite the official claims of the leadership, seeped into the movement, both at the top, through their writings, and through their chapters as well. And there were reports, and I'll just give this last example, reports, for example, of, and this divided some members, right? a Bircher wrote in and said, we've got a problem in our chapter. This is in California, where some of our members are bringing in Gerald L.K. Smith articles, right, by the notorious white supremacist and anti-Semite, and they're passing around this like really notorious, this bad anti-Semitic literature, and I'm afraid to bring my friends because I'm worried they're going to get turned off. And the headquarters said, well, we're concerned about that, but maybe we'll investigate it further. I mean, it was a bit of a tepid response, but you can see how, anti-Semitism is bubbling up from below as well. And part of it is because a lot of the anti-Semites were attracted to their conspiracy theories.
The John Birches start in October 1958.
Yep.
And yet, no organization comes out of nowhere. So they start in 58, but because you've mentioned Gerald L.K. Smith, who are its predecessors in the 30s and 40s? Because one of the things I want to point to, something that you suggested is, and it's part of the subject today, the link between all these groups and what we saw on January 6th, 2021. So where are they evolving out of? Who are the far right of the 30s and 40s?
They clearly have predecessors in the 30s and 40s. One of the most obvious ones is America First, the America First movement, the anti-World War II movement, led in part by Charles Lindbergh. I believe Robert Welch, who founded the Birch Society, was supportive of America First and may have been active in it. There were other Birch members who I think also supported America First. Fred Koch, one of the founding members and maybe the most famous member, the Koch family patriarch. He had, as Jane Mayer has revealed in her book, he had refineries both in the Soviet Union, I believe, but also in Nazi Germany. And there's evidence that he liked the efficiency of Nazi Germany. And that's not to say that in the 30s and 40s, the predecessors to the Birch Society all sympathized with Nazi Germany, but America First, there were elements of that. More broadly, there are aspects of the old right, or the kind of what some people call the paleoconservatives. And there's an ideological pedigree for isolationism, for example, in white supremacy, in even before the 1930s. People like Father Charles Coughlin, the radio priest who became a notorious anti-Semite. I'm not saying, again, that there's a kind of one-to-one correlation, but, a lot of these ideas are, of course, and the anti-communists, right? The idea that there are radicals on the left, communists, who are alien, who are un-American, who are destroying the country from within. Well, that, goes back prior to the 20th century, of course, and has deep roots. So there were many kind of pre-World War II elements, ideological, some groups as well. And of course, I don't think quite I would make this link, but clearly, as you write about in your book, the Nazis in LA in the 1930s, those who were sympathetic to Nazi Germany. There are, some Birchers who, I think come out of that ilk as well, or they're sort of fellow travelers in the 60s who are aligned with that. And so there's a deep history.
So I grew up in Queens, and so I was a kid in the 50s and early 60s. And I can tell you, living in a part of Queens, Whitestone, that was my family survivors, then was surrounded by survivors. And I could tell you this, everyone, we knew about the John Birch Society, and by the late 50s. And when the larger family circle, family and friends, there was no question this was an anti-Semitic organization, no matter what they had to say. And as far as we knew, they were the most, right-wing group. But now, something Matt and I talked about before, the Birchers aren't as far right as I thought. And around 1961, George Lincoln Rockwell, the founder of the American Nazi Party, in his weekly or monthly magazine, had a flow chart of political groups in America, with the GOP being kind of on the left. Well, it's hard to say. The GOP is kind of on the left there. What he argued is you have the GOP conservatives would be, if you're looking at the world of the right wing, the GOP conservatives are sort of to the left. Then a little further to the right to them are John Birch. He puts John Birch in with the GOP, arguing that they are respectable people and they care about being respectable and they want to work within the boundaries of, quote, American democracy, law and order, etc. And then he argues, well, if you want to talk about the real far right, you're talking about the National States Rights Party, you're talking about the American Nazi Party, and you're talking about a group that no one knows about today called the Colombians. And also in New York City, the first Nazi party in America formed after war was formed in New York in 1949 called the National Renaissance Party. And what made them different from the Birchers is they were calling for the immediate extermination of all Jews in America and sending all Blacks to Africa, either voluntarily or involuntarily. This is a very different set of far-right politics than the Birchers, and they make the Birchers look good.
Well, yes, although some of those people did have ties to Birchers. So this guy, James Oviatt, who I mentioned, the ADL found that he was renting out his headquarters to, I think it was called the Christian Defense League. And one person in particular who was a protege of Gerald L.K. Smith, who, I would lump in with the groups that you just mentioned. There were, in addition to the groups I mentioned or individuals I mentioned earlier in the conversation, there were groups that the Birchers did not officially endorse, but they certainly were involved with it. So, for example, Breakthrough, which was a group founded by a man named Donald Lobsinger in Detroit, and it wasn't quite as far right as the neo-Nazis per se, but it did have some Birchers in it. And what distinguished it, though, is that it believed in street action, and it would violently break up anti-war protests. This guy Lobsinger and his people beat up an anti-war priest. Lobsinger actually stormed the stage when Martin Luther King was speaking in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, 3 weeks before he was assassinated, and prevented him from doing his Q&A. And so they were kind of Birch adjacent. And I think that's in part what I mean about there's a bit of a continuum, because it's no accident that so many people like Willis Carto kind of flow through the Birch Society at one point. But I think you are right that there were a number of people on the far right, the kind of fringe, who were disgruntled with the Birch Society. They were, some of them were disgruntled Birchers. Some wanted the Birch Society just to go, all out. And as one white supremacist said, call a spade, and basically, put the blame on the Jews directly, as opposed to maybe beating around the bush. And so I think what you're getting at are these interesting internal debates, in a sense, about what is that. Now, the last thing I'll say is this idea that, well, the Birchers are respectable, and in some ways they are, absolutely. I mean, a lot of them are rich, a lot of them are upwardly mobile. One of the founders was named the Milwaukee Sentinel's Man of the Year in 1953 and led the YMCA. Right? They are respectable in some key ways. But a lot of them are not as well, right? A lot of them, and you do see kind of evidence of some of them becoming violent and associated with the KKK and other groups.
Let's talk a little now. I'm going to switch and then we'll go more contemporary. But really what I want to talk about is the question of Jewish resistance to hate. How did Jewish leaders of the 50s and early 60s respond to the John Birch Society?
Well, so the Jewish leaders, and remember, of course, really by the early 60s, it's the height of the civil rights movement and the liberal coalition. And the Jewish leaders and really activists and Jewish activists in the grassroots that I focus on were in the Anti-Defamation League. And there were, of course, others as well. But they responded by looking at the Birch Society and also other groups, of course, on the far right or far right, and being very concerned that these were either incipient fascist movements in the United States and that they were kind of homegrown authoritarian threats to democracy. So the ADL have a whole chapter basically on the ADL program to actually spy on the Birch Society, to infiltrate the Birch Society. It was led by a man named Isidore Zak, who, I think is a name basically lost to history, but he was director of fact-finding and public relations for the northeastern region of the ADL. In World War II, though, he had been a team leader of a counter-subversive army unit based out of Boston, where they were ferreting out spies and looking for a Nazi and other fascist activity and communist activity to undermine the U.S. war effort. Zak earned a number of medals and commendations, and was really a respected and experienced spy master. He went to the ADL in 1947, and they start, to make a long story short, they start infiltrating the Birch Society. They use agents had code names. They're ferreting out employment records for Birchers. They're doing credit checks on Birch members. They, at one point, I think they set up a meeting, a chapter meeting of the Birch Society in order to learn more about an actual Bircher, but the chapter meeting was kind of on false pretenses. They worked with the press. And ultimately, what they were trying to do is to discredit the Birch Society. And again, there are other groups too, but the Birch Society in particular that I focus on, discredit them as an agent of hate, as a group that was outside the boundaries of two-party politics, and that was anti-democracy. And they were quite effective, I argue, and actually played an important role. The Jewish leadership again, and the grassroots played an important role in really keeping the Birch Society to some extent on the fringe, especially after 1964, after Barry Goldwater lost the Republican presidential campaign in a landslide defeat.
Well, you just said something that's interesting, that the ADL saw the Birchers as outside of the boundaries of democracy. And yet, the talks I've been giving, both on Hitler in LA and the book I'm working on now, The Secret War Against Hate, where I'm also looking at 1945 as my starting point. And the ADL, the American Jewish Committee, and a group that no longer exists called the Non-Sectarian Anti-Nazi League, all of whom were spying in the 40s, believed that anti-Semitism is going to go up after the war. And those three groups run spy operations until the late 70s. And the ADL is still running them. And people have asked me, very sympathetic people in the audience, how do you justify spying a group, spying on others? And just to be very specific, during the 1950s, even before the Birch Society, Americans knew because the spy reports would then, as you write, you have a wonderful line that the ADL weaponized the information it received. So people knew it was coming from somewhere, and they figured out it was spy operations. And the most prominent conservative journalist of the 50s, the Tucker Carlson of his day, was Westbrook Pegler.
Yes.
And he referred to the ADL, the American Jewish Committee, and the Anti-Nazi League, all of whom were spying on the far right, the far ultra-right, as the Jewish Gestapo. And he denounced them all for spying on patriotic American Christians. And 70 years later, the same thing is being said in Congress when Marjorie Taylor Greene condemned the ADL's current undercover operations. Of course, in her brilliant wisdom, she referred to them as the Jewish gazpacho.
Oh my God, gazpacho, yeah, the soup.
Yes, not the Gestapo, the gazpacho.
Yeah, gazpacho, yes. Well, it's close, you know.
What do you think of the ethical questions that raises?
Yeah. So this is a great question for me in particular, because I really thought about that quite a bit when I discovered these documents. At first, I was taken aback because I ask in the book, you know, why would an organization devoted to civil liberties and civil rights seemingly contradict some of its, at least, ideas by using subterfuge tactics? So what do I think of it? As I got deeper into it and as I started writing, I guess I became more sympathetic to the ADL, in part because they uncovered a lot of stuff that was understandably scary. You know, they uncovered worries about Birchers collecting guns, and they were worried, you know, about easy access to firearms and violence. They uncovered a lot of examples of anti-Semitism. There are reports from some of their agents that at one meeting, a couple Birchers were complaining that the television news, they never let Hitler rest in peace. And so they, you know, and I try to explain in the book, right? One of my jobs, I think, as a story writer, is to try to explain, to help us understand, well, why would they take these steps? Well, you know, we weren't that far removed from World War II and, of course, Hitler. And I think that there was a sense that McCarthyism, which, you know, in early 1950s had been allowed to, if not run amok, right, had not been taken as seriously and maybe counteracted as aggressively as it should have been. And so I guess I became more sympathetic over time to the aggressive tactics and the fact that they were professional as well. I talk about one woman in the book, a woman named Roberta Galler, who is the only one I found who actually kind of admitted that there was a spy operation in the ADL's fact-finding department. And she's a very sympathetic person. She described, she had polio as a child. When she got to Northwestern University, she was disabled and she had to live on the first floor. But the first floor then, in I think the earlier mid-50s, was a Christians only floor. So they said, okay, you can live on the first floor, but you've got a room with another Jewish student. So they put her in a Jewish only room. And then she realized that African Americans on campus had like their own segregated dorm or floor. And she, long story short, she makes her way to the ADL's fact-finding department because a professor connects her. And I think they realized how smart she was and how good she was. And they trained her. And she said, look, I became a spy on the far right wing. I posed as a white supremacist. She later went and became active in the civil rights movement. And her one regret was that her memos were later sent to J. Edgar Hoover and to the FBI, which was also, of course, tracking the Birch Society, among many other groups as well. And she regretted because Hoover, of course, was notoriously against the civil rights movement or harassed civil rights leaders. But I did become, I became, again, I'm not trying to justify it, but I did become more sympathetic because I tried to understand and capture what they were concerned about. And I think that they had a lot to be concerned about.
Well, I've gone from being sympathetic to more than just sympathetic.
Okay, yeah, tell me your take.
Well, from the days in which I used to be a political theorist and studying state theory, going back to Locke, Hobbes, and why do people form states? Why do they organize? And the bottom line is state formation is about self-preservation. That if we live in the world of Thomas Hobbes, where life is nasty, short, and brutish, it'll be the rule of force. Starting in 1945, starting in the 30s and 40s, what many Jews around the country here discovered is that authorities would not protect them from harm.
Yes, exactly.
That you have the police. I mean, the guy I write about, Leon Lewis, he's gathering all this information. He's running a little spy operation after Nazis open up their first meeting in LA in July 1933. He recruits people, 4 men and their wives. They go undercover and join every Nazi and fascist group. And within a few weeks, he gets, as a lawyer, he knows what permissible evidence means, to take evidence into court. And he says, I'm going to gather that evidence and I'm going to bring it to the police and they're going to take it over. And he brings it to the chief of police of LA, James Davis, who tells him, after 2 minutes, he says, you don't get it. Hitler's only doing what he has to do to save Germany from the Jews, and that the real threat in LA are not Nazis and fascists, but all the commies in Boyle Heights, which is the Jewish neighborhood. He goes to the sheriff, who says the same thing and throws him out. And finally, he goes to the FBI, the local agents, and they're actually sympathetic, and they say, there's nothing we can do unless J. Edgar Hoover, approves it. And one thing you're too delicate to say is Hoover's an anti-Semite. He doesn't care about Jews. He just cares about commies and tracing them. And so Leon Lewis has to keep that spy operation running for the remainder of the war years, even after Pearl Harbor. And in the new book I've discovered, imagine this, the first week of May, 1945, the heads of the ADL, of their undercover operations, the ADL, American Jewish Committee, and Anti-Nazi League, are sitting in Manhattan, literally blocks from one another, and unknowingly write the same memo. That is, right now, there are over 200 far-right anti-Semitic groups in America. 200. We think, well, maybe there are a few. 200. And what we are worrying about is we know anti-Semitism is going to go up after the war, not down. And that our great fear, we fear 2 things. We can deal, if we keep running undercover operations, we can deal with any one group, including the Ku Klux Klan. Our great fear is that all these groups are going to figure out a way to unite and combine their forces. Then we're in trouble. And our second great fear is that some of these people are going to leave the far, far right, ultra right, and make their way into one of the 2 mainstream parties and take these far right ideas and turn them into the center of either the Democratic or the Republican parties. We need to save ourselves and protect ourselves.
Well, I want to just piggyback on a couple of things you said. So the fear, of course, as you say, was that the anti-Semites in particular, and also white supremacists and racists, that they would sort of move into the mainstream, right? Or that they would achieve a kind of institutional power in the 2-party system and in other areas of American life. And so that was, part of the impulse. But the point I also really want to emphasize is that even in the 1960s, so in the early 60s, especially, John F. Kennedy's administration was very worried about the far right and conservatives, and actually Meyer Feldman, one of his aides, wrote this 80-page memo about all the different conservative groups that spanned from kind of the more respectable ones, but The John Birch Society was a big one, and I'm sure some of the groups you mentioned were also in there. And they're tracking them. They're trying to analyze how much money they have, and they view them both as a major threat to democracy because of their beliefs and their tactics, but also that they can weaponize them in the '64 campaign against Goldwater. Even still, though, the ADL and I think the NAACP and many others understood that the FBI was much more interested in tracking and harassing the left. It's not like it is today, where the Justice Department has come down, I think, pretty hard on the insurrectionists on January 6th. And we look to the Justice Department, the federal law enforcement, to really be the tip of the spear, right? At kind of protecting against far-right domestic extremism. Back then, that was not the orientation of my understanding of the Justice Department or the FBI. The other point I'll mention, and then I'll turn it back to you, is that, the Birchers had a campaign, a front group called Support Your Local Police. And there were a number of Birchers who were police officers. And this became a pretty controversial issue. But part of the fear, of course, was that, you would marry law enforcement with conspiracy theories, and anti-Semitism and white supremacy, and that would be also another very scary combination. And so, I think they were right to be afraid.
So when and why? First, let me just remind the audience, we'd love you to ask any questions. Just put them in the chat box. And I see right now we have 3. I'd love to get a few more from you. Any question. So when and why did the John Birch Society decline?
Well, there's no kind of precise moment. The organization still exists today. They have a website. You can go on it. And it now is in Appleton, Wisconsin, I believe, is its headquarters. Back in its heyday in the 60s, it was Belmont, Massachusetts. I argue, though, that really by around 1970, or the late 60s and the early 70s, and actually I have a whole article in the Atlantic that came out a couple weeks ago, in part based on the book, but in part based on this idea, well, how do far-right organizations, how do they wither? And what I argue is a couple of things. One is that there are external factors that constrain the Birch Society. The mass media had a lot more cultural authority back then, right? Long before the days of social media. Organizations like the ADL, the NAACP, Americans for Democratic Action, Group Research Inc., which was a union-backed effort to track the right wing and the far right. There are also individual trackers, like a guy named Gordon Hall. All these people over many years that really had, I think, an impact, right? A kind of collective impact. And, you can see in the polls, the Birch Society, in particular, when Gallup would ask this question, they had a pretty low, consistent ceiling of support. They had some support, but, it really, went above 4%, right, in the country. Sometimes it was at 2%. And I think these external forces, as well as some political leaders as well, kind of helped to constrain the movement, discredit it, brand it as extremist. The other force, though, is that there are all kinds of internal forces churning within the Birch Society. One, their conspiracy theories are attracting even more radical people in the late 1960s. Some of them are prone to violence. Some of them are just much more explicitly bigoted and anti-Semitic and just, a white supremacist. There are, memos going into headquarters, Birch Society headquarters, from individuals who are talking about how they don't want to confront this Bircher, who's also, I guess, in the KKK, because they're worried that he and his wife are going to attack him, like they're really just prone to violence. And there's a lot of internal dissent. Robert West, a leader in '66, even has to travel the country trying to glue these chapters, because they've operated in 20-person chapters, glue them together because there's a lot of infighting. And then the last piece is they started to run out of money, or they became increasingly reliant on very wealthy donors. And so there were external and internal forces that I think came to a head. And in the sense, the group kind of burned itself out. And really by the early 70s, it for most, I think, Americans, it was really an epithet. And it was seen as a spent force, as an organization.
Many people today think that the ultra-right emerged with great vigor under Donald Trump, that before then they were just hiding under rocks and they weren't really significant. But you suggest that, in fact, the major split in the GOP of GOP conservatives, sort of old-time conservatives, versus the ultra-right emerged during John McCain's primary run in 2000. Can you talk about that and explain what happened and how it altered the course of the GOP over the next 2 decades?
Yeah, well, and I don't want to overstate a particular moment, but I do think that's an important moment. So, McCain is well known in that campaign for standing up to the woman. Remember, he grabbed the microphone from the woman who said Barack Obama was an Arab or a Muslim, and McCain grabbed it away from her and said, "No, man, he's a decent American. We just have different beliefs." But at the same time, of course, McCain had to patch up some of the wounds that he had caused with pretty far-right figures in the evangelical movement. He had denounced them, I think, in 2000 as agents of intolerance. He had to patch up some of those wounds and stand by their side. He, of course, picked Sarah Palin, who, arguably became a leader of the Tea Party and actually had ties in Alaska to very far-right individuals and groups, including the Alaska Independence Party. And structurally, I think what we see in the Republican Party is this movement away from George W. Bush and Reagan and Bush-style conservatism. I mean, Bush was very, very conservative, but a rejection in many respects of the wars, especially in Iraq, and seen as a failure, a rejection of an anger at the bailout of the banks during the 2008 financial crisis, a repudiation and really outrage on the far right, I would say, of Bush's efforts to enact bipartisan comprehensive immigration reform. And this is not to defend George W. Bush's policies in any way, which I actually deeply disagree with, but it is to say that a lot of people a lot of conservatives or people who once define themselves as conservative, they rejected a lot of the George W. Bush conservative agenda. And he fell into the 30s. I think the low 30s approval ratings, didn't even appear in person at the 2008 Republican convention. And I think you can see the forces that, now we know as MAGA, that became the Tea Party. We can see those forces really beginning to surge in 2008. And by 2010 and on, you start to see them really get more organized, win a lot of seats in Congress, and become an even more forceful within the Republican conservative coalition, and redefining, in a sense, what it means to be a conservative.
So in a sense, far right becomes moved to more of the center, so to say. And what we used to see as liberal Republicans are no longer even in the building.
I mean, even Liz Cheney, who is quite conservative, quite conservative in terms of a Reagan, sort of George W. Bush, Dick Cheney conservatism. Even Liz Cheney is now read out of the party, right? I mean, she's been excommunicated. She was primaried and she got crushed in her primary. So yeah, the liberal Republicans, the Jacob Javits, and kind of Nelson Rockefellers and Dwight Eisenhower's the moderates, they're obviously gone. There are, I think, a number of still established, what I would call, I guess, establishment Republicans, for lack of a better phrase. Even people like Mitch McConnell. I don't think he likes Trump. I think he thinks Trump has cost him the Senate probably a couple of times. And I think that he's very conservative. He aligns with Trump on some issues, but I don't think he kind of shares a lot of Trump's more nationalistic impulses. And so I think there are, real splits within the Republican Party still. But yeah, I think as I argue, the fringe in a way has become the center, or at least the dominant force in the Republican Party, at least as of today.
So let me ask you one or two more questions, then we'll turn to the audience. The sort of standard question is, what lessons does your book offer us for today?
Yeah, well, it's I wish I had more answers to that question. So going back to this Atlantic article I wrote, I do think that thinking about how institutions, and that's why the ADL example I think is so poignant and interesting, but thinking about how governmental and non-governmental institutions push back on some of these forces, some of these anti-democratic forces, the conspiracy theories, anti-Semitism, and Black anti-Muslim racism. Those institutions, as weakened as they have atrophied in some ways, especially the media, right, no longer has the same authority or respect, but they're not completely gone. The Justice Department, I think, is actually doing some damage to groups like the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, some of whom have been convicted of a seditious conspiracy. A lot of the insurrectionists are in jail from January 6th. And I think the mainstream media, to the extent it exists, I think has it's made it harder for, look at what happened in 2022. The election deniers that Trump basically helped to nominate, most of them in all the key swing states, they lost. They lost very winnable races. And I don't want to be Pollyannish here, but in Pennsylvania, in Georgia, in Arizona, in Nevada, in New Hampshire, these places were all gettable seats for Republicans, but they nominated election deniers who, were very supportive of Trump and MAGA. And I do think that there were some institutions that, push back on, including the Democratic Party. But again, as I say, I think some governmental and law enforcement institutions and the courts as well, right? The courts pushed back on Donald Trump and his election denial conspiracy theories, which could have been a disaster if they had not done that. So I do think that those kinds of constraints in terms of lessons learned can still, the kind of guardrails of democracy, I think, can still be important. And then I would say as well, I don't know if this is even a lesson, but, how do we think about democracy? How do we teach democracy? How do we teach the norms of democracy? And then the last thing I'll say is, that's an important theme. And the last thing I'll say is, remember, we've only really had a multiracial democracy since the mid-1960s. And so it's a pretty recent experiment. And I think another, maybe, I don't know if it's a lesson or not, but, as I say in the book, in the 60s, the liberals, like Kennedy liberals and the ADL liberals, they, I think, understood what some political scientists have called a liberalism of fear, right? This idea that things can always, a kind of persistent anxiety that things can get worse. And I think that, amid the glow of Barack Obama's election and kind of breakthrough election, I think that, a lot of liberals and some conservatives as well who believe that Trump could never win, right? And, MAGA could never be on top, I think kind of forgot that, things can get worse, right? In democracy, it's not like a constant march forward. And I think remembering that as well can be a useful mindset.
All right, we have a few questions. I'm going to start with the local ones.
Right?
First one, I grew up in Southern California in the 1960s and remember being told not to go to Knott's Berry Farm because it was associated with the John Birch Society. Do you know what the connection was?
Yes and no. So Walter Knott was a very conservative, kind of very pro-free market individual, right, who set up Knott's Berry Farm. And I do not believe that he himself was a bircher. I mean, at least I never found evidence that he was a bircher. But he did, he seemed to support financially some of the other groups or individuals who were around the Birch Society. So, he might have been someone who, I'm sure, supported Goldwater in 64. But there were also people further to the right as well. And there were some groups, I don't want to kind of name them for lest I get them wrong, but there were some groups that were, kind of sympathetic to the Birchers, aligned with the Birchers, and not, was supportive of them. And so, for example, I believe, I'm not 100% sure, but I believe that he supported Joe Schell, who was the Republican minority leader in the California Assembly, who ran against Richard Nixon in the Republican Party primary for governor in 1962. And Schell was not a Bircher, but he had a lot of Birch support. And I think Knott was also behind him. So the folks who were, people who were telling you, don't go to Knott's Berry Farm, it's a kind of Birch, a Birch home, that's, I think, essentially correct. He was, I think, sympathetic to a lot of the causes the Birchers supported.
So another local question. In the late 60s, there was a John Birch Society affiliated bookstore on Westwood Boulevard called the Betsy Ross Bookstore. What, no relative of mine, by the way. Was this an attempt to appear respectable? There were rumors at my middle school that one of our teachers worked there as a volunteer. I went in there once and thought it was creepy. Was this how the society helped support itself? And are there equivalent businesses today? And what are they?
That's a great question. So the answer is yes. The Birch Society had a very robust, business-focused bookstore operation around the country. They also had what they call mobile bookstores and mobile libraries. Actually, these vehicles that would go around, I guess, with books and magazines. And the way these things would work, first of all, there were like 40, 50-page pamphlets or books actually on how to set up your John Birch Society American Opinion bookstore and library. And so there were these incredible manuals. Some of the members, I believe, actually put their own money into these bookstores. They were operated as a business. They were expected to generate income for the Birch Society, and as well as to be, as what one historian, a very good historian, Michelle Nickerson, described as kind of the coffee houses on the left, right? And so when you describe, the questioner talks about them being creepy. Well, they were supposed to be meeting places where, Birchers and just people supportive of the movement could trade ideas. They could have discussions. They could get access to the latest literature. They could get American Opinion, which is the Birch magazine. A ton of books, right? That none dare call it treason, none dare call it conspiracy, 9 Men Against America, on and on. There were just an incredible number of books, and I think it felt like a kind of movement culture, right? Almost, you're part of a movement, you're part of the subculture, you are in the know, right? And you have a kind of alternative access to a set of alternative facts, so to speak. So that's a kind of historical question. In terms of today, it's really interesting to think about. Certainly, a lot of the Birch leaders were industrialists, and they came out of the National Association of Manufacturers. I think 4 of the original 12 founders, or 3 of the original 12 founders, had been president of the National Association of Manufacturers. They're very successful businessmen, all men, And certainly Donald Trump was in some ways a very successful businessman. I mean, even if you think he's exaggerated his wealth, which he clearly has, he's certainly been an incredible marketer, and he's been incredible at branding. And he seems to have been making a lot of money off of and being excellent at fundraising, making money off the MAGA movement. MAGA made money off the election denialism, the conspiracy theories that the election was stolen from Trump. And so there is a kind of a through line in the sense of, or a kind of business orientation toward business, and most business people, I'm not saying, support MAGA or support the Birchers, but that is an element of it. And then, finally, I would say, even though the media landscape has shifted dramatically, clearly, social media, whether it's Twitter or Truth Social or Breitbart or the Daily Caller or Fox News, they serve in a very different landscape, I think, a similar function of kind of providing in a much more, with a louder bullhorn, a much louder and bigger bullhorn, an alternative set of ideas, conspiracy theories, alternative facts, so to speak, that people can absorb and identify with.
Just one quick footnote here. When you mention the National Association of Manufacturers, and here are these business leaders, I think many people in the audience don't know the National Association of Manufacturers was a right-wing organization. Starting in the early 20th century, they were leading the what's called open shop, the anti-union movement throughout the country. And they're one of the groups that was constantly saying business is being attacked by communists. Business is being attacked by communists. All these strikes after World War II were being led by communists. And of course, they never mentioned that those strikes were being led in part because the government allowed no price control, but had wage control. So when men and women came back from World War I, cost of living had gone up 100% and wages maybe 20%. They were angry. They weren't communists. They were angry. But NAM has said they're all commies. So another organization I have a question about wasn't one of the most anti-Semitic organizations, the Liberty Lobby, and aren't they still around today?
So the Liberty Lobby was, and Steve, you probably know far more about it than I do, but the Liberty Lobby was led and I believe founded by a man I mentioned earlier, Willis Carto, who had been in the Birch Society at one point and left. And I'm not sure if he was pushed out or he left on his own volition, or if anyone even knows. And he went on and he founded this group. And my understanding is that he became the most notorious Holocaust denier of the late 20th century, or certainly one of them. And I think he died. He died within the maybe 1990s or maybe the 80s. I once remember reading an obituary about him, and he was quite notorious and quite visible. And there's actually a quote in the book from I think one of his lawyers or one of his aides in the Liberty Lobby, and the aide says basically to the effect that it takes, quote, a lot of little old ladies in tennis shoes to fund this operation. And the reason I chuckle is that is a reference to the Birchers, right? Stanley Mosk, the former California State Attorney General, in a report on the Birch Society, described Birchers, in part at least, as little old ladies in tennis shoes. And that kind of became an enduring moniker. So it suggested, at least some overlap, right, between the society and the Liberty Lobby. In terms of today, I don't know if they still exist. Steve, do you know?
I'm not sure if the Liberty Lobby does. No.
If it does, it's certainly I think a shadow. It's not enough. It's not very high profile if it does.
Well, now we have a question from somebody who clearly reads history and wants to know, where does your talk today fit in terms of Richard Hofstadter and his paranoid style in American politics?
Oh boy. Wow. Well, this is a really another great question. So Hofstadter actually, when he wrote that essay, and he also wrote about what he called pseudo-conservatives, he was talking, at least in part, about Birchers and about Robert Welch, and about these conspiracy theorists. And so where do I fit? So, most historians in the past 20, 30 years especially have said that status anxiety, right, which is Hofstadter's argument, this idea that, Americans who are suffering from a loss of status were sort of lashing out in these irrational ways. That is not really what drove, that they were these Birchers and also mainstream conservatives. They were rational, they were middle class or upper middle class, they were educated, professional. Lisa McGurr writes about this in her book, Suburban Warriors, and that you can't really understand, say, the Birchers just as these paranoids, right? And a piece of that, the Bob Dylan composed a song, Talking John Birch, Paranoid Blues, right? And so that was the one of the themes, right? That the Birchers were really paranoid. But I try to avoid, so where does it fit? I try to avoid that term. One, because I think it has psychological connotations, and I'm not really equipped, I guess. But also because, the Birchers were very shrewd and they were very politically effective, and they were often rational. They knew kind of modern society. They were embedded in the culture and in the mainstream in a way, even if their ideas were fringe. They had mainstream associations and affiliations. And I don't think that paranoid, when I was at least looking at them and looking at some of these conspiracy theories, I don't think that it at least helped me to understand kind of where they were coming from. I think they were able to use conspiracy theories, and surely some of them believed in them, although not all. They were able to use them and weaponize these theories as a kind of message about the decline of the country, about the internal threats that they faced, and really as almost a catch-all about the evils of whether it's the big government or the deep state, or academia or the mass media, and understood how conspiracy theories can mobilize people to get active in the struggle for power. That's not to say that, again, Welch and others didn't necessarily. They did believe some of their theories, I think, but they also understood how powerful they were. So, in summary, I would say that I didn't walk away from this book. I walked away from the book and the research thinking some of the Birchers were racist, some of them were anti-Semites, some of them were all kinds of other things, right, that I could identify, but I didn't feel like paranoia was a useful term.
Well, I can tell you during the late 60s for the anti-war movement, paranoia was a useful term, because those of us claim that, the movements were being suffused with FBI agents. We discovered many years later, you're not being paranoid if they're really out to get you.
Well, and even paranoids have enemies, right? Isn't that the same? So the irony, of course, and then I'll wrap up with this, and I wanted to mention this earlier, is that the Birch Society knew that the ADL was onto them in a big way. And they must have known that they were infiltrating them, because they kept referencing the ADL spying on them and using these kinds of tactics and techniques. And John Rousselot, who was a California congressman, but also a Birch leader, he said of the ADL, they're on our backs all the time. Another rabbi who was actually sympathetic to the Birch Society said, the ADL has gone berserk. And the ADL was, infiltrating them. And so, even the conspiracy theorists did have, they had enemies, and their enemies were real, and they were inside the gates, so to speak.
Well, the reason they also weren't being paranoid, and the reason, they said they're infiltrating us, is because the ADL took the information in those reports and put it out in the ADL bulletins. And as these far right groups read, because they did read the ADL, American Jewish Committee yearbook, and they said, wait a minute, there's no way they could get this information without having somebody inside. So they knew it.
And they fed it to the press too. The ADL really worked the press very effectively.
Walter Winchell, Drew Pearson were their two big outlets.
And even the local media, like I found really fascinating instances in which the local Boston papers, or in Vermont, the newspapers, and they're tracking the different articles about the Birchers. They're working with editors and reporters sometimes, and not all editors and reporters are sympathetic, but some are.
When you mentioned Schmitz, we have a question here. I remember John Schmitz and John Russello, two U.S. congressmen from Orange County, as Birchers. Are there any others in the House, Assembly, or State Senate during those years?
There were. So I think there were 4 Birchers in Congress. The other 2 were Edgar Heistand in the early 60s from California, and then Larry McDonald, who actually, my understanding is that part of his district is now Marjorie Taylor Greene's district. And he was a Birch leader in Congress in the 1970s. And so I found that there were 4, maybe I'm missing 1 or 2, but there were not that many. And then there were some in the state assembly and Senate, I'm forgetting their names. There weren't that many of them. Schmitz actually started his career, I think, in the state Senate and before he went to Congress. But one of the points I try to make in the book is that the Birchers, and even frankly Republicans or Democrats who support the Birch Society, they were pretty few in number, and they were really pretty fringy within the Republican coalition. So when Schmitz is in Congress and Nixon is president, Schmitz starts saying all these very critical things about Nixon. And at one point, he quips Nixon when Nixon went to China, and it's part of the opening to China. Schmitz canceled, I think, a meeting he was going to have with the Nixon White House, and then he quipped that I don't care that Nixon went to China, I just don't want him to come back. And really offended. I know it sounds pretty soft in terms of today's rhetoric, but the Nixon White House was, I think, quite offended at that. And then Schmitz actually, and another Bircher named Tom Anderson, they ran on the American Party ticket in 1972, challenging Nixon and McGovern, the Democratic nominee, as a third party ticket. And they lost pretty badly, got about 1% of the vote. But they did run as a third party from the far right. And that's another way, too, I think we can kind of define the far right, which is that challenge to the Nixon Republican Party.
So to bring that up to date, what do you see as the future of the two-party system, and in particular, the future of the Republican Party?
Oh, boy. Well,
yeah. Oh, boy.
Well, first of all, at least historically, obviously, third parties tend to not do very well. Third-party challenges tend to not do very well. There are exceptions, of course. George Wallace in 1968, as a third-party candidate, won, I think, 13% of the vote. And of course, Teddy Roosevelt, the Bull Moose candidate, did very well, winning, I think, maybe 20%. Ross Perot. So it's not unheard of, but usually those third parties, they have an effect on one election and then they get co-opted, or their ideas. They may have 1 or 2 big ideas. Ross Perot, let's say, in deficit reduction, they get co-opted by the major parties. So it is hard to see a world short of major structural reforms like multi-choice voting everywhere, or other structural reforms. It's hard to see a world of multi-party system in the U.S. Republican Party, my sense is that if MAGA candidates lose enough elections, the politicians, the people like Mitch McConnell's of the world, or John Thune or whoever, that they will be more empowered internally to make the case. I mean, I think the only thing that is probably going to change maybe the balance of power, at least shift it a bit, is a series of defeats. And remember, after 2022, a lot of Republicans or former Republicans came out and said Donald Trump's party lost in 2018, we lost in 2020, and we lost in 2022. And, that's pretty accurate. And so that argument, maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but that argument could potentially be powerful at some point among Republican voters. There is some evidence that Republicans are tired of Trump. So it is hard to see. I guess the bigger question too is, do Republicans go back to a more kind of internationalist, interventionist posture, or do they remain more isolationist, anti-NATO, kind of pro-Putin? What happens with the conspiracy theories? What do you do about, Nick Fuentes and white supremacists and the militias that are now around them, and all of these other kind of issues that Trump has surfaced? That I think is that's a much longer term project. But of course, it's a big problem for the country to have two parties, and one of them, is kind of beholden to conspiracy theories, for example. Right? It's very hard to have a functional democracy.
Well, I want to thank you, Matthew, for exploring how the John Birch Society led to the foundation of the radicalization of the American right, and consequently, how the bigotry of decades past has energized the far right today. And in particular, this whole idea of combating hate begins with understanding its origins. And you've given us a really good comprehensive overview of the phenomena that we are continuing to struggle with today. And I want to thank you for that. And I want to thank our audience for tuning in today, for devoting their afternoon to the conversation. And I welcome you to join us again in our upcoming events. And I wish everyone a happy, enjoyable, wonderful evening. Thank you all for attending. And again, thank you, Matthew.
Thank you so much for having me. It was my honor. And thank you to the audience. And thank you, Steve, for your great questions. Thank you.